The corridor was narrow and badly lit, and Mick Jagger was walking toward her. It was November 1969, Madison Square Garden, New York City. Backstage, in the kind of hallway that exists behind every legendary stage, concrete walls, exposed pipes, the smell of sweat and electricity, and something that might have been ambition, two of the most recognizable figures in rock music were about to occupy the same 6 feet of space for the first and last time. Janis Joplin was 26 years old. She had come to the show not as a headliner but as a guest, a friend of the bill, one of the many artists who had gathered around the Rolling Stones' first American tour in 3 years. The Stones were returning to the country like a force of nature reasserting itself after a long absence, and everyone in the music world had come to watch. Janis had come to watch, and also because she never could resist a room where something real was about to happen. Mick Jagger came around the corner and they nearly collided. What happened next lasted no more than 4 minutes. There were no cameras, no journalists, no one who later claimed to have been there told exactly the same story. But what is known, what the people who were nearby in adjacent rooms, in the visible edges of that hallway, consistently reported, is that the two of them stopped. That they looked at each other with the particular recognition of people who understand exactly what the other person does for a living and have complicated feelings about how differently they do it. That words were exchanged, that one of them laughed and it wasn't Mick, and that Janis Joplin walked away from that conversation carrying something she would not be able to set down for the rest of her life. But to understand what passed between them in that hallway, what it meant and why it mattered, you have to understand who each of them was before that moment. You have to go back, further than 1969, further than either of their first records or their first shows or their first reviews. You have to go back to where both of them came from and understand what the music had cost them and what it had given them and why those two accounts didn't balance the same way. Janis Joplin came from Port Arthur, Texas, a refinery town on the Gulf Coast where the horizon was always the same distance away, and the rules about who you were supposed to be were written in a language everyone understood and no one questioned. She was born on January 19, 1943, the eldest daughter of Dorothy and Seth Joplin, a woman of practical warmth and a man of quiet intellectual restlessness who read philosophy and asked questions that the town around him had no particular interest in answering. From her earliest years, Janis absorbed that restlessness and amplified it into something the town found considerably less charming. She felt things at a volume the people around her found inappropriate. She had opinions, appetites, a hunger for expression that Port Arthur experienced not as vitality but as deviation. By the time she was in high school, the social verdict had already been delivered. She was too much, too loud, too raw, too strange, too unwilling to make herself smaller so that the people around her could be comfortable. What she found in the blues, in the recordings of Bessie Smith and Big Mama Thornton and Lead Belly that she discovered in her teenage years, was the first evidence that feeling too much could be a form of power rather than a defect. These were artists who had taken the most extreme versions of human emotion and turned them into something that lasted. If that was possible, then maybe she wasn't broken. Maybe she was just tuned to a frequency that Port Arthur didn't have the equipment to receive. She left, several times and in several directions, before she found the one that held. San Francisco in 1966 was a city remaking itself, and the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood was where the remaking was loudest and most serious. She found Big Brother and the Holding Company, a band that could hold her voice without flinching, and she found a community of people who had also fled places that had no room for what they were. For the first time in her life, the intensity that had made her an outsider became the thing that made her essential. The Monterey Pop Festival in June 1967 changed everything. She walked onto that outdoor stage as someone the industry didn't know and walked off as someone it couldn't ignore. Her performance of Ball and Chain that afternoon, the way she inhabited that song, the way she held the final note until it trembled with something beyond technique, the way Cass Elliot stood in the wings with her hand over her mouth in involuntary awe, was one of those rare moments when a performer and a song and an audience arrive at exactly the same place at exactly the same time, and what results is not entertainment but something closer to revelation. Cheap Thrills, released in 1968, went to number 1. Piece of My Heart became a radio constant. Her face appeared on magazine covers. She was famous in the sudden, total way that fame arrives when the world decides to pay attention all at once. Fame, Janis was discovering, is not the same thing as being known. The gap between being seen by millions and being understood by even one was something she had not anticipated, and nothing had prepared her to navigate it. She gave everything in every performance. The audiences took everything she gave and asked for more, not from ingratitude, but because that is what happens when you offer the whole of yourself to a crowd of strangers. The whole of yourself is not something they can hold. They can only hold the feeling it produces, which is a different thing. And that difference, night after night, was quietly accumulating into something Janis hadn't yet found a name for. She would find it eventually. But first, there was 1969, and Madison Square Garden, and Mick Jagger coming around a corner in a badly lit hallway. Michael Philip Jagger was born on July 26, 1943, in Dartford, Kent, England, 6 months after Janis, on the other side of an ocean, in a world that could not have looked more different on the surface, and was underneath, engaged in many of the same negotiations about what a person was allowed to be. He had come to American blues the same way Janis had, through records, through the electricity of hearing someone express something you had felt but not yet found language for. The difference was what he did with that electricity. Where Janis internalized it, made it confessional, Mick Jagger exteriorized it. He built a character. He constructed a persona so complete that the distance between Mick Jagger the performer and Michael Jagger the person became one of the defining features of his artistry. The persona was not a mask worn reluctantly. It was an aesthetic choice, a way of channeling the blues tradition's emotional power without surrendering his own interiority to the transaction. By 1969, the Rolling Stones were operating at a level of cultural authority that few acts in rock history had achieved. They were dangerous in the way that only bands genuinely indifferent to approval can be dangerous. Mick Jagger on stage was a study in contained explosion, the suggestion of wildness without its loss of control. He was emotionally present in a very specific and deliberate way, and almost entirely unreadable. You could not tell, watching him, what he was actually feeling. That was the point. The Stones' 1969 American tour was historic before it began. 3 years away from the country, a new album, a lineup that had absorbed tragedy and kept moving. They arrived in November with the particular momentum of something that has survived. The shows were extraordinary. The crowds were enormous and slightly feral in the way that Stones crowds always seem to be, as though the band had given them permission to be dangerous by refusing to be safe themselves. And backstage, in the hours before and after those shows, the world of rock music was gathering, because that's what happens when the Stones play. Everyone comes. Everyone wants to be in the same building, the same corridor, the same conversation. Janis Joplin was in the building, and so, rounding a corner in a narrow concrete hallway, was Mick Jagger. The accounts of what happened when they stopped in that hallway are consistent in outline and inconsistent in detail, which is exactly what you'd expect from a 4-minute encounter that no one was officially recording and everyone was too aware of to pretend they weren't watching. What is consistent, they knew each other by reputation, had crossed paths without meeting directly, and had been aware of each other the way artists doing genuinely different things are always aware of each other, with recognition and wariness and something that might have been curiosity. What is also consistent, Mick opened the conversation. He was gracious in the specific way that very confident people can afford to be gracious, unhurried, slightly amused, in possession of all the time in the world. He said something about having heard her perform, about what she did on stage. He said it with what people who were nearby described as genuine admiration, wrapped in the kind of delivery that always left a question about whether the admiration was genuine. It was, in other words, very Mick Jagger. What Janis said in response is the part that varies by account, but the version that appears most consistently, the one that people in adjacent rooms said they heard clearly enough to be confident of, was something that cut through all of it. Something direct and unguarded in the way that Janis was always direct and unguarded, which was sometimes her greatest gift and sometimes the thing that left her most exposed. She looked at him and said, in the approximate words of everyone who claims to have heard it, "You give them a show." "I give them everything I have." There was a pause. The hallway was very quiet for a moment, in which the sounds of the venue, the crowd noise, the distant equipment check, the thousand sounds of a building full of people waiting for something to begin, seemed to recede. Mick Jagger smiled, not the stage smile, a smaller one, the kind that happens when something lands and the person it lands on is honest enough to let it show, he said, and which one of us will last longer doing it your way? Janis laughed. It was, by all accounts, a real laugh, not a deflection, not a performance of amusement. Something genuinely struck her as funny. And then she said something that the people nearby could not hear clearly, and Mick said something back, and after another minute or two they moved in their separate directions down the corridor, back toward their separate dressing rooms, their separate preparations for the night ahead. 4 minutes, maybe less, but what remained afterward, what each of them carried away from that exchange, was something considerably heavier than a brief encounter in a hallway should have been able to produce. The question Mick Jagger had asked in that corridor, and which one of us will last longer doing it your way, was not a taunt. People who know his work and his way of speaking understand it as something more complicated than provocation. It was, in its fashion, a genuine question, a philosophical one, the kind of question that two people who have each built their careers on a different answer to the same underlying problem might ask each other when they find themselves unexpectedly face to face. Mick Jagger's answer across his entire career had been built on the understanding that the persona is the performance and the person is separate from it. That you can give the crowd the explosion of energy and image and movement and suggestion that they came for and walk off stage with yourself intact. That control and freedom are not opposites, that the most effective freedom is performed, shaped, directed. That Mick Jagger the performer and Michael Jagger the man could coexist without one consuming the other. Janis Joplin's answer was different at every level. She didn't have a persona, she was constitutionally incapable of maintaining one. What she gave the audience was not a performance of herself but herself, as completely as she could manage on any given night. She didn't leave anything in reserve. She didn't construct a character to absorb the impact while the real person stood safely behind it. She opened all the doors. And what came through, the grief, the joy, the longing, the 26 years of Port Arthur and San Francisco and Monterey, is what the audiences were responding to when they responded to her. The two approaches produced results that were, in their different ways, equally extraordinary, and they carried costs that were, in their different ways, equally real. What? Mick Jagger understood what his question in that hallway was pointing toward was that Janis's approach had a sustainability problem. Giving everything every night without the protection of constructed distance was spending from a finite account. The realness at that level of exposure and that pace of demand was not something that could be indefinitely maintained. He was not wrong. He was also not entirely right. Because what he couldn't have accounted for, what the persona-based approach to performance cannot fully access, is what Janis's method produced in the people who witnessed it. The specific feeling of being in the presence of someone who is genuinely, completely, unguardedly themselves. The way that kind of presence changes a room. The way it makes the audience feel not like observers but like participants in something that is actually happening as opposed to something that is being expertly staged. Janis Joplin returned to her dressing room after that encounter and said very little to the people who were there. Those who knew her well describe her as quieter than usual for the remainder of that evening, not withdrawn, not upset, but thoughtful in a way that suggested she was turning something over in her mind, processing something that hadn't finished arriving. What she was processing was not the encounter itself but the question underneath it, the one she had been circling without quite confronting for the 2 years since Monterey had changed her life and the world had begun turning her into a symbol. She had felt, across the months of touring and recording at the level that fame demanded, something she found difficult to name precisely, a kind of depletion that the shows themselves didn't replenish, a gap between what the performances required and what ordinary life gave back. She was not unhappy in any simple sense. She was funny, warm, engaged, someone who laughed easily and cared about her friends with a fierceness that surprised people who expected a star to be more sealed off. But she was also, at some level that she was beginning to acknowledge to herself, if not always to others, tired. Not physically tired, though that was part of it. Tired in the way that comes from living your interior life entirely in public, from making your most private emotional responses into the material of your art, night after night, in front of crowds who received those responses as entertainment rather than as the actual, specific, irreplaceable things they were. Mick Jagger had built walls that let him contain the explosion without Being consumed by it, Janis had never built those walls, and by 1969 she was not sure she could, even if she had wanted to. The performing and the feeling had become the same thing. She could not manufacture the distance. It would have required becoming someone who was not Janis Joplin, and she had spent too much of her life refusing to do exactly that. In 1970, Janis assembled the Full Tilt Boogie Band and something shifted. She seemed to be approaching the music differently, not with less commitment, but with something added to it. A sense of herself in relation to the music that had previously been more instinctive than considered, as though the years of living her answer to Mick Jagger's question had produced something she hadn't had before, a perspective. The Pearl Sessions are widely regarded as the finest work of her career, not the most raw, not the most electrifying in the way that Monterey had been, but the most complete. The voice that had been overwhelming in its power was now also overwhelming in its wisdom, closer to a balance between giving and keeping than she had ever managed before. Me and Bobby McGee, recorded in September 1970, captures something the earlier recordings hadn't quite managed. A quality of settled grief, of someone who knows exactly what things cost and has decided with full knowledge to give them anyway. The line "freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose" was one she had been living for years. The way she sang it suggests she had arrived at a place where she understood it not as surrender but as a form of power. She did not know in that studio that it would be the last recording she completed. What she knew was the song, and she gave it everything. On October 4, 1970, Janis Joplin died at the Landmark Motor Hotel in Hollywood, California. She was 27 years old. The Pearl Sessions were nearly complete. The album was released in January 1971 and reached #1 on the Billboard charts. Mick Jagger heard the news while the Stones were still in the aftermath of their own enormous year. People who were around him at the time describe a rare stillness in his response, not the performed stoicism of someone managing grief, but something quieter and more private. He had known her for 4 minutes in a hallway, but he had understood in those 4 minutes something about what she was and what she was doing, and he understood in hearing that she was gone what the music had lost. He never spoke extensively about that encounter, consistent with who he was, the protected. Interior, the managed disclosure. But in the rare moments when Jagger has been asked about Janis Joplin, what comes through is not critical distance. It is recognition, the acknowledgement of someone who understood from the inside how extraordinary her approach actually was and how rare. The question he had asked in that hallway, and which one of us will last longer doing it your way, has an answer that is more complicated than it appeared in 1969. Mick Jagger is still performing, still drawing crowds, still commanding stages in his 9th decade with an energy that seems to have negotiated a private arrangement with time. By that measure, his approach lasted. But what Janis Joplin left behind has also lasted, in a different register entirely. The recordings, the footage from Monterey, the testimonies of everyone who was in a room when she performed and has been trying ever since to describe what that was like. The specific, irreducible feeling of encountering a voice that held nothing back. That quality, that particular form of artistic courage, does not diminish with time. It becomes, if anything, more visible as the years accumulate, and it becomes clearer how rare it actually was. She lasted, not in the way he had perhaps meant, not through decades of continued production and tour, but in the way that something genuinely itself lasts, because authenticity at that level of intensity does not go away. It embeds itself in the people who witnessed it and travels forward through them, finding new listeners in each generation who feel it land with the same force it carried in 1967, 1968, 1969, and every night she ever sang. The hallway at Madison Square Garden where they stood in November 1969 has long since been repainted and repurposed and walked through by thousands of other people on their way to thousands of other stages. It does not know what it contained for those 4 minutes. Hallways don't, but the music knows, the recordings know, the people who were in those rooms know, and have told the people who came after them, who will tell the people who come after them in turn. Janis Joplin gave them everything she had. Night after night, city after city, she opened all the doors and let the audience in, and what they found inside was not a performance of a person but the actual person, the girl from Port Arthur who had been told she was too much and had decided at every available opportunity to be exactly that. Too much, and then more. Mick Jagger asked her which of them would last longer doing it her way. She laughed, she walked away. she went back to what she was doing. And she did it for exactly one more year, in a series of recordings that remain some of the most honest documents of what a human voice can carry when the person it belongs to has decided there is nothing worth protecting more than the truth of what they feel. That is the story that was written in a badly lit hallway in November 1969, in 4 minutes that neither of them planned and neither of them forgot. Two artists. Two philosophies, one question, and an answer that the music has been giving ever since.